You don't need 100,000 followers. You need the right 1,000 to 10,000 followers, right? If you have the influential people in your niche who you have strong relationships with and build those over time, that's what's going to make the difference for you. Like, yes, there's some level of social credibility that comes from seeing someone has 100,000 followers or more or something like that, but that's sort of a different game. Right? That's going to make it so people are interested in talking to you. But in terms of interested in actually working with you and helping you, it's more about having the right people in your audience and building strong relationships with them.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Coda. If you want a platform that empowers your startup to strategize, plan, and track goals effectively, you can get started with Coda today for free and get a $1,000 credit at coda.io/TSP. That's coda.io/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get started for free and get a $1,000 credit. coda.io/TSP. This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. You might know that sinking feeling. You're about to land a big contract when they ask about compliance. SOC 2, ISO, PCI, Essential 8. You've just snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Not anymore. Vanta massively accelerates your compliance efforts and allows you to get those life-changing deals back on track. Don't wait until it's panic stations, though. Get started with Vanta today. They're offering 20% off their prices just for TSP listeners. Do yourself a favor. Hit pause, go to vanta.com/TSP, that's VANTA.com, to get that 20% off.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode. In-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption, the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hi, I'm Yaniv.
And I'm Chris.
I'm Houck.
And today we're going to talk about how to build and leverage your personal brand as a founder. This is a topic a number of you have requested, and we're delighted to have the perfect guest to help us talk you through it. Michael Houck is a venture-backed founder, investor, and former Uber and Airbnb employee. He has leveraged his own brand as a founder to perfection, building his newsletter for founders to over 88,000 subscribers and growing fast, and launching a number of businesses off the back of his brand and community. He has also launched the Megaphone network, an engagement network connecting founders with big, reputable creators in their niche who can help amplify their content on X and LinkedIn. We're excited to talk to Houck about how you too can build a personal brand that makes your life as a founder that little bit easier. Houck, welcome to the show.
Yeah, Yaniv, thanks for having me. Chris, thanks for having me. Super excited to do this. Definitely a topic that I love and have a lot of thoughts on.
It's a bit of a mysterious topic. Like I said, a number of people have reached out and said, you should do an episode on this. I guess Chris and I, we do a bit of the personal brand game, but I think you're well ahead of us on this. And it's sometimes seen as a little bit cringe, but I think people also understand the importance of this. So as a founder, you're busy, you're trying to keep your business alive. Why bother with a personal brand?
Yeah, I mean, it can help in so many ways. So we found investors, we found great employees, we found tons of customers for my last company through Twitter and to a lesser degree, LinkedIn. The people you want to get in front of are spending time on these networks and they are creating content, consuming content more so. And if you put things out there that resonate with them, it's just an easy way to build those relationships and build those connections that you otherwise wouldn't be able to without running into them in person somewhere. And to your point, when you do it, you sort of have to be shameless about it. I struggled with this for a long time when I was just starting out as a founder. It was like, I should be spending this time on building my product. And here I am writing some like cringy, clickbaity thread on Twitter that is going to get some attention. But like, why am I doing that? You have to put yourself out there. You have to be shameless. That's how you get the attention to what you're doing that will ultimately drive the results you want.
The way I think about personal brand is there's a lot of advantages to brand, I think, that people understand intuitively, right? If you're looking at a Nike shoe versus a brand X shoe, we know that we have a natural and innate draw or sense of affiliation or affinity to the Nike shoe, right? And we don't even know why. It was working on a subconscious level. And I think that's true of individuals as well, and it's becoming increasingly true. And the way I think about it is relationships at scale, right? Is being able to build a community of people who consider you part of their Dunbar number, right? Part of the 120 some people that they know and like, even though maybe you haven't met them or barely know them. But you mentioned it can be cringy. Both of you mentioned it can be cringy. Does it have to be cringy? And this is something I guess I struggle with as well, is like how clickbaity, how manufactured, how intentional does it have to be in terms of seeking and drawing attention versus being, fairly straightforwardly you and hoping that people notice?
Yeah, I mean, It's basically how much you want to leave up to luck, right? If you are like, this is a growth channel that I see for my startup, or this is part of my strategy to get in front of investors, get those meetings that, they just ignore my cold email otherwise, right? If there's a strategic component to it, then you have to treat it like part of your operations, part of your growth strategy, to come at it with a mindset, with an approach, research what works, and then create content that follows that formula. I was fortunate to have people who are the best in the game, Lenny Rachitsky, Sahil Bloom, who helped me in the early days and kind of guide some of those early decisions. But yeah, you have to lean into it, in my opinion. If it's just like a hobby or just like something you like to do in your spare time as a founder, which, who has spare time as a founder in the first place? But if you do, then of course, just write posts, throw it into the void and hope people see it. But there's definitely a strategic approach both to writing your own content and to engaging with other people's content that can drive real results for the business. And in my mind, I hyper optimize my business. And so if I'm not doing something that's returning some form of value to it, it's not worth it for me. So I just think about it that way. I definitely see people who are kind of like post success, right? Like someone like Mark Andreessen or Elon Musk, right? They're just sharing whatever comes into their mind and people are going to be interested in it no matter what. But chances are that you're not Mark Andreessen and you're not Elon Musk. And so you sort of have to play the game and understand what people respond to and what gets them interested in someone new who they haven't heard of before.
I mean, I think what you're talking about is intentionality, right? And I actually said the other day is that personal brand, it's really just a new word for reputation, which is something that has existed forever, right? Which is the view that other people have of you in their minds. And, there's that old saying, your reputation precedes you. You want something that speaks for you, that has you in people's minds before you even enter the room. And I think personal brand in a lot of ways is an extension of that. And I think it's associated, to your point, with these modern tools, especially social media, newsletters, things like that. But when you talk about a personal brand, you talked about it very much in the context of you're creating a business. And in the same way as if you're building a brand for the business, you're not just like, hey, we're a great business, we do great stuff, and we're just going to talk about that. You think about what you want to be known for, right? And what really is going to cut through in that channel. And then you build a brand around that. And of course, the brand should be authentic and true to yourself, but it has more intention behind it than that. I think I'm nearly at the being myself and putting myself out there stage of personal branding, and it's worked quite well. And I think I feel an anxiety nearly about trying to put more intention into it, and it can feel limiting to say, okay, this is what I want to be known for. But I completely appreciate that that is how you get that outsized returns. And I guess to turn it into a question, how can you be intentional in building a personal brand?
Yeah. So I think one thing that people get wrong about their personal brand is that they think that whatever they're saying now is going to be what defines them indefinitely, right?
Mm.
You can totally change how people see you and what you put out content about. It's hard if you build up a big audience in one niche to then pivot to another niche with that same audience. You might want to start a new account or something like that at that point. But I've seen it work. There was a guy who made an AI newsletter. His name is Zane Khan. He had previously been in these sort of like frameworks, mental models space, and he'd put out a lot of content about that, built up a decent sized audience on X about that. And then when the AI craze hit a year ago, he went all in on that. He totally shed his personal brand, changed his profile, changed the type of content he put out there. And now his newsletter, I think it's called Superhuman, has like 400 or 500,000 subscribers. And it's this giant business for him because he rode the wave and was able to put out good content about AI at the right time. And now he's known as like the AI guy or one of the AI guys on X. So I think people overestimate how much they pigeonhole themselves, because that guy can grow over 100,000 followers and then pivot. You probably can too if you only have, a couple hundred or a couple thousand. It's probably not that serious, right? So I would encourage people to focus solely on what their goal is right now for their business, if they want their personal brand to be associated with their business. And we can talk about that. But if that's the case, use your personal brand and your accounts as like a lead generation mechanism for the business. Share the journey transparently, try to build in public where you can and where it's competitively appropriate to, and just talk about the subject matter that your business is focused on helping people in. So if you're trying to solve a problem for them in one sector, create great content about that sector or about that problem, and you'll attract the right audience there. So I would just say be intentional in focusing on the one thing that your business is trying to do. But at the same time, don't worry if the business fails or if you decide to work on something else. There will be some level of affinity with your audience that will follow you, although you obviously have to put in the work to cultivate the new audience in a new niche as well.
I want to talk about intentionality a little bit more broadly. I think the first piece of intentionality you're talking about is picking your niche and aligning it with your business and your intent. It feels like there's another layer to it, which is kind of below the surface that people don't talk about at all or enough. Is it enough to just create the content and publish it? Or it feels like there's this layer of like timing, tags, team that are sitting behind that nobody wants to really talk about. Or am I just because I don't know what it is. What is going on behind the scenes that makes a post? Let's assume you've got something interesting to say. Let's assume you've written some version of that. Is there some secret to optimizing the language, optimizing the timing, optimizing the tags, optimizing the team that is babysitting and nudging that? I read recently about this thing called link communities or content communities where people are liking each other's posts to boost them within the first 10 minutes for the algorithm. What is really going on for the people who are having these very successful brands take off?
Yeah, look, there's the dirty underbelly of social media. It's not even really a dirty underbelly. It's just something that most people don't know about. But the secret is if you see an account getting really big all of a sudden and you get a lot of engagement on their post, you're like, where did this guy come from? Right? What's usually happening is that person has relationships with some big creator or creators who are engaging with their post very early on and getting it in front of their audience. And if the niche of the engager's audience is aligned to the niche of the content that's being put out by this new person, then that audience is really going to like the content. They're going to follow that person. They're going to engage with it. It's going to get more impressions, assuming again that the content is well written and there's like a strong hook. And we can get into the nitty gritty of like, how do you structure a post to make it appealing? But the content's half of it. The other half of the battle is the engagement and the amplification. That's something that I think, to your point, not a lot of people know about or talk about because it's all through relationships, right? All these big creators that you see, they have their WhatsApp group chats, their Telegram group chats, their iMessage group chats, where they share posts, they give each other advice on content. But most importantly, when the posts are shared, they go in, they comment on it, they like it, maybe they retweet it, whatever the case may be. That's happening everywhere in every niche. It's just sort of this like back office game that no one is talking about. So that's one of the things that helped me over the course of the last few years is that through my last startup, I was able to build a relationship with a lot of these people and they were interested in what we were doing and what I was saying. And so I got exposure to a lot of their audiences and was able to build up my own at the same time. And, I thought to myself, like, why can't I make that accessible to everyone? Why do I need the invite? Why can't I just let everyone get the benefit there that I got? So that's why we built Megaphone. So Megaphone is this engagement network where anyone can sign up, you pay a monthly subscription, and then you can share posts with the network. We match your posts to the right creators who are currently online in your niche and like currently available, ready to engage. We match and send it to them separately, and then they go engage with it and drive engagements, followers, impressions to your content, to your account. So that's something that we've been doing for a couple months now. We're up to about 250 paying users, over 100 active creators with 10 plus million, maybe 11 now, a million followers in aggregate across Twitter and LinkedIn. And we're doing over 20 million impressions a month. So it's growing dramatically. We just want to make this accessible to more people. And for every post that you share, you can sort of set your own budget for how much you want to amplify it. So that's something that I kind of saw for myself and then was like, why don't I just make this a little more accessible and out in the light?
Yeah, I really love that actually, because I think in startups and maybe in business in general, there's always this sort of strong network effect where the benefit accrues to the insiders. If you already know people, then you get all of these benefits. And one of the things we do with this podcast is to try to democratize it a bit, right? I know also with your newsletter, right? Which is to share the inside story, to give people access who may not be traditional founders who are super well networked. Give them an understanding of the game and give them access to the tools. And I think with Megaphone, it does sound like that's what you're doing, which is to say, yes, there is great content. There is the algorithm, and there is also the people who you know, who you need to leverage to actually build the algorithm. And you're right, just as you mentioned, Lenny and Sahil, right? Those were from the companies you worked at and from the business that you built, right? And those are two huge creators. And I think that there is this game, right, of leveraging those relationships as you do in anything to do that. And so I think providing access to those is really cool.
Yeah. I mean, look, I came into Silicon Valley, I came into tech with no connections, right? When I graduated from college, I was working at a small startup in Philadelphia where I grew up, and I was an engineer there. And I didn't know anyone in the Bay Area or in venture or anything like that. Managed to work my way in through a job at Uber, then Airbnb, and then was able to build a startup and raise from some of the best investors in the world, like A16Z. And, it's just, I've seen the advantage of sort of being able to build that network for myself. And I know that it's possible, even though it seems daunting to a lot of people who haven't been able to do it. And so I want to help people get access to that and get access to the benefits of that, and also just build a stronger network in general. If people are putting out great content or building great startups and who knows where, they should be able to get some attention for what they're doing and be able to build it into as big of a thing as they can. So that's my personal mission right now.
Yeah, and I think it's so important. And again, with this podcast, what we've seen is there are founders everywhere in the world. We have listeners in over 100 countries, and they have access to capital these days. What they don't have access to is the networks and the tools and the experience. And so I think that means that the capital can't be deployed as effectively. And we get founders reaching out to us all the time saying, how do I do this? How do I get in front of the investors I want to get in front of, or anything like that? And I think this is where that personal brand, that reputation becomes incredibly valuable, as well as the knowledge of the game. And to your point, you can be a founder anywhere. The beauty of this densely connected network is it doesn't take long to go from nothing to being quite an insider, but you need to do the work and you need to be intentional about it. So I think that's a really valuable point. Just going back to the question of intentionality, and you talked about what are your business goals? One question that a number of people will be wondering is why invest in a personal brand to grow your business when you could just invest in your business's brand?
This is one of my favorite questions because
Hmm.
the answer is once you know the answer, it's so obvious. It's super simple, right? People want to build relationships and they build relationships more quickly and more strongly with other people. If you see some post from a brand page that you've never heard of, it's going to come off like an ad, whether the person who created it is going to want it to or not, right? There are some counterexamples to this where the brand is written in such a casual and colloquial, like Gen Z style voice that it does come off as like, hey, there's a human behind this. But it's very hard to do that effectively. It's very hard to be intentionally casual, or the surfer hair that you like just have off slightly and it looks like you just woke up. It's actually super hard to do for someone who's not like naturally doing it. And so in my mind, focusing on building your personal brand is going to give a more clear voice. It's going to give a more clear connection for the person who's looking to jump into using your product or using your service or whatever it might be. And you're going to be able to build a stronger connection and more trust more quickly. So for me, it's way more authentic. At least it comes off that way. And so I think it's really, really important to focus on that. A great example of this in the startup world is Andrew Gazdecki, right? He's a guy who has built previous startups. He's now building acquire.com. And I think he built his personal account to like 200,000 followers just talking about startup advice and how to get acquired and the acquisition process and all that stuff to drive people to acquire.com and to build attention for acquire.com before they even started really growing the acquire.com account. And now that he has a strong account with a big following, he can drive people to the acquire.com account. And all of a sudden it's way easier to build that second account after you have the first one. So I would say a combination of focusing on one asset to build that up as quickly as possible so that it's easier to build others. And the easiest asset to build is the personal one because it's way easier to build trust quickly.
Yeah, and it's also not one or the other, right? You have to think of yourself and your career as this long-lived game that is going to span over multiple companies, multiple projects, multiple brands. And so investing in your own personal brand and your own personal learning and development, even while you invest in the development of your brand, of your company, of your next startup, is equally important, I think, as well.
That's totally true. I ran a venture back company for 2.5 years, and then all of a sudden it wasn't there anymore, right? I decided to move on from the company and I was able to take my brand with me. I'd started the newsletter while I was there and it became a viable business basically the day that I resigned. So it's super important to have that to travel with you. But at the same time, it's the right strategy also for the business.
So let's pivot a little bit. You mentioned that a personal brand can feel more authentic and can perhaps accelerate your relationship building, but it also needs to have an actual authenticity, right? You need to find your voice. And a lot of people, we've talked about mental health on the show. We've talked about people who tend to have a little bit more anxiety or a little bit more hesitation. How do you overcome that anxiety of putting yourself out there, and how do you find that authentic voice?
Yeah, it's a tough question. You really just need to try it. And the good news is that once you kind of internalize that no one really is listening to you in the beginning, right? If you have if you have 10 followers, if you have a couple hundred followers, honestly, even if you have like 1,000 or 2,000 followers, no one's really going to be like, "Oh man, I can't wait for the next post from so and so," right? They're not going to remember that a few weeks from now, a few months from now. You can post the same post again later and like they'll probably still engage with it, not remember it from last time. So once you sort of realize that no one really is going to remember or care, especially when you're just starting out and have a tiny audience, you have to let that anxiety sort of melt away and just say, hey, this is an experiment. I'm going to see what feedback I get. I trust myself to be able to iterate on that feedback and get better and better. And as I get better and better, the audience will get bigger. But thankfully for now, no one cares.
It's a bit of a it's
Yeah.
a bit of a paradox, right? Because they don't actually necessarily remember what you say, but it builds up over time. There's a saying which is people might not remember what you say, but they all remember how you make them feel. And a lot of brand building is actually people are not literally listening to every word, every post, everything that you're saying. They're just left with an impression. Oh, this person is thoughtful on this subject, provides insights about this area. And over time, that starts to accrue in their mind. It's something my CEO used to say at one of my previous startups was that PR is a movie, not an image, right? So it's 24 frames per second. You have to kind of keep publishing frames so that the story makes sense. You can't expect there to be one launch, one event, one post, one thing that people are suddenly going to go, oh my God, that's you, that's done, it's over. You have to kind of lower the stakes for any one thing and just keep trying, right?
Yeah. And I mean, look, to that point, that's a great point. To that point, if you're at that early stage, you only have a few followers, the amount of impressions you're going to get on your post, you can see it both on X and LinkedIn. You can see how many impressions that a post gets. If that's 10 or 200 or 1,000, chances are it's not even going to be those same people who see your next post, right? Like if I make a post today, I have 50,000 on X. If I make a post today and it's not like a great post, it doesn't get a lot of attention, it's probably only going to be seen by somewhere between 1 and 10,000 people. And those people might not even be within the 50 that already follow me and already know me and already have an impression of me. So people really over-index on how much of an impression they're leaving on people because it's really only one frame out of those 24 per second, to your point, that it takes for someone to remember something.
I've got a couple of thoughts on the finding your voice. So the first is, and I think you've gotten to this one, is just get started, right? You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So if you want to start building your personal brand, just build your personal brand. It's the same as building your startup, right? Like run experiments, be lean, put out MVPs, don't overthink it. Just start doing, iterate quickly, right? You don't know what's going to work. You don't know what's not going to work. I think one of the things that people worry about is people associate, they have their own face next to it. And so they worry. But, there's this saying, no one's paying as much attention to you as you are to yourself. Most people just aren't paying attention. So get started.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. The team at Vanta are passionate about helping you secure your business. By vastly cutting down on the time to get compliant with frameworks like ISO 27001, SOC 2, and Essential 8, Vanta lets you close deals, sleep better at night, and get back to building your product. Help yourself and help the podcast by going to vanta.com/TSP for an exclusive 20% off deal.
I guess just one small question. This comes back to that sort of intentionality. I'm just going to put to you my thought, and I love your feedback on it, which is some people might want to start just being themselves, just putting sort of random personal work-related stuff out there. Some people might feel safer coming up with sort of an intentional niche and then posting into that. But the most important thing is just to get started. And once you've got the ball rolling, then you can refine. What do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think TikTok is a really good example of this. I don't personally spend time on TikTok, but I've worked with a bunch of startups that have got thousands and thousands of customers from it. And so what we consistently see is that you will put something out in the early days and maybe even you'll think it's good. Maybe you'll be convinced, maybe you have consultants who are telling you, oh man, this is so good. Or your content person telling you, man, this is gonna crush from day one, right? Usually it ends up not being true. And the algorithms on these sites will intelligently know how to serve your content to the right people. And they'll know the signals that indicate that it's good content. And so what ends up going viral, what ends up being your niche, what ends up defining your initial brand for those first few thousand followers or whatever the case may be, might not be what you think. And so the key is just to get the reps in. I know that there's people who even set up like 5 or 6 Instagram accounts for the same startup with slightly different handles, and they'll post sometimes the same content across multiple of them, sometimes different content on each of them, just so they get more shots on goal, more reps to see what resonates in their niche.
The next thing we wanted to quickly talk about, Houck, is imagine you're a founder, you're building your business, you've gotten to the point where you've got some personal brand equity, you've got a following. What are some ways of leveraging that to maximum effect?
Yeah. So let's say you've been somewhat successful building your personal brand. The good news is that you have people now out there who to some degree trust, but at least like and are interested by the way you think. Right? Because what content really is, it's a way to communicate how you're thinking about something. So whether that's humorous, memey content on the current thing, or whether that's thoughtful content about your niche that is unique to your experience and people can't find anywhere else. Either way, you're communicating how you're thinking about something. The people who follow you are people who are interested in that. So the way to leverage that is basically if you have good knowledge of who's in your audience and keep good track of that, you can easily find connections through that audience and the people will have some level of trust and they'll be able to help you make those connections. So let's say that, you have someone who's a follower who is a founder who is invested in by an investor who you think would be a good fit for your cap table too. All of a sudden, you've got a reason and a way to talk to that founder, make a connection because they like your content, and maybe even get an intro to that investor from a warm source that the investor trusts. So it's not like you have to cold email them. So we've had people, for example, through Megaphone who've had Mark Andreessen follow them because we amplified their content and I got out there. He saw it, he liked it, he thought it was funny, and now he follows them. So it's always surprising to me the wide range of people who you can meet through these scenarios. As I said at the beginning, we found investors, we found early employees, we hired a Y Combinator founder, we hired someone who went to Stanford GSB, mostly through social media. And another good story here is we had a founder who we invested in, a solo founder, and her company got an investment from Balaji basically by DMing him like 13 or 14 times with like concise progress reports on how they were doing. And he didn't respond for the first 12 or 13. But then on the last one, he was interested in investing in the company and he did. So putting your thoughts out there gives people sort of like a record of how you're thinking about things. And that helps to build trust. That helps de-risk a fundraising deal. It helps de-risk an employee to employer relationship and a whole bunch more.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, I didn't think of it this way, but when I was really early on in my career, based in Australia, kind of looking longingly at Silicon Valley, I started blogging and kind of building my personal brand that way and responding to posts and writing my own posts and so on. And I would credit that with a huge chunk of my early success. I got to know early influencers. I got to establish my credibility. I launched things like the Data Portability Project off the back of that. I got free accommodation in Silicon Valley, riding people's couches. When I was trying to launch something, people would ask about me to do a reference check, and they had my history of thinking on the blog and other people who'd been reading my blog to kind of validate my credibility. It was a huge, huge part of my early career, even to the point where jumping in on Twitter at the right time with Robert Scoble when he was talking about personal data, that was the thing that actually blew up one of my first major initiatives, the Data Portability Project, and just skyrocketed it. And that was all down to participating in social media, building relationships on social media, earning credibility through social media, having a history of thinking in public, and then writing that way. And I've never had massive audiences, but I've always had influential audiences or people who I know and like, who themselves are very credible, have very large audiences, who I'm friends with because of social media. And I find that's just an essential part of being a founder, being an entrepreneur, and being an actor in the modern world. So huge ways of leveraging this.
Yeah, you don't need 100,000 followers. You need the right 1,000 to 10,000 followers, right? If you have the influential people in your niche who you have strong relationships with and build those over time, that's what's going to make the difference for you. Like, yes, there's some level of social credibility that comes from seeing someone has 100,000 followers or more or something like that, but that's sort of a different game. Right? That's going to make it so people are interested in talking to you. But in terms of interested in actually working with you and helping you, it's more about having the right people in your audience and building strong relationships with them. So when I think about how to use social media to grow my business or get customers, I'm not trying to grow my follower count on Twitter to do that, right? I'm trying to build deeper relationships and make sure that the right people are in my audience.
I was going to say, folks who have been listening to us since the start, you may not realize that Chris and I only got to know each other through social media. We actually didn't have a previous relationship. We were following each other on LinkedIn. We enjoyed each other's content, and we thought, let's team up and do a podcast. And it's quite surprising how often these quite deep relationships form starting that way. So I think that's the point. And maybe just one other way of framing it is, we're talking about cold intros, right? If you have a personal brand, if you have a reputation, that means that cold outreach is not that cold anymore. You're slowly warming up all those channels, right? And, you reach out to someone and you might not know them at all, but they've seen some of your stuff. They know what you stand for. You have a little bit of credibility in the bank already. And the power of that, the power of just lowering the activation energy of forming a new relationship with someone, it's incredibly strong, incredibly empowering.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is something Naval said, which is like increase your luck surface area. Social media is sometimes really tough to measure the value of consistently posting right away. Like, yeah, you see the impression count and the engagement count, but like, what is that really doing for your business, for your startup? But to your point, it totally makes that wall easier to get over, right? Like, we run a fundraising support process through my founder community, and I have a bunch of investors who I send deal flow to every month, and those deals come from our community for the most part. But we also are always reaching out to new investors to have them join the list and get the deal flow and send over samples and things like that. I get way more responses to those cold emails, like some of the biggest and greatest investors in the world, who they're like, oh yeah, I've seen you on Twitter, or I love your content, or man, it's so good to connect. And those are valuable inboxes where they get tons and tons of pitches every single day. I would imagine that having the audience on Twitter and LinkedIn and having the newsletter has been a big part of making it easier to actually get responses and get them interested in what we're doing.
Exactly. It comes back to that old concept of reputation. And maybe going back to that earlier point in the conversation, there is that highly intentional personal brand as a business that you are pursuing, for example, where you're like, okay, I want, like you said, 100,000 followers, not for the sake of it, but because I'm using this as a launch pad for certain businesses that I'm building. And then there is also the personal brand that using social media and other channels as a way of amplifying your reputation. It's not that you have to choose one game or the other to play, but both of them are valuable, right? And you said early on, perhaps not many people are paying attention to you. But if you do this, Chris, to your point, if you make that movie, if you've been doing it for a few years, it starts to get surprising. Then suddenly people know you a whole lot better than you think they did, right? You reach out to someone, they're like, yeah, like you said, oh, I've been following your content for a while. I like it. And the chances of getting a reply just get higher and higher. And that is incredibly valuable. It just reduces the friction on nearly everything you might want to do as a founder. And so that to me is the core reason why you want to build that personal brand.
If you're very lucky, you might start getting recognized at WeWork like Yanev.
Yeah, that's right. I've become a minor WeWork celebrity. I get
I haven't hit that status yet, man. Yeah, no, I mean, you want to be able to open an increasing amount of and increasingly important doors throughout your life, right? Your professional life, at least. You want to be able to make things happen more quickly, and that happens by being able to open the right doors. And if you're not rubbing shoulders with Sam Altman in Silicon Valley, you can easily use social media as a way to build yourself towards the digital version of that in a way that you wouldn't be able to in person.
Cool. So I just wanted to have a quick tactical session. So if founders listening, they're like, I don't have more than 5 minutes a day to invest in this. Like, what do I do to efficiently build my brand? This is not going to be my core approach, but I want to do something. What do I do? What's your 5-minute prescription?
5-minute prescription is super easy. So what I would do is I would first find 10 to 20 accounts in my niche who have big audiences and who get a lot of engagement and impressions on their posts, right? Identify who those people are on day one. Then go to their profiles and turn on the notification bell to get notified on your phone when they make a post. Then every day from that point on, just keep an eye on your notifications like you already would. And when you get a notification about one of their posts, very quickly write a either slightly thoughtful or slightly funny reply and just leave it there. You don't even need to be posting content consistently on your own account. You should sometimes, for sure, to show people that it's active. But what you're really doing is fishing for profile views and fishing for conversion to followers. So way better to ride the wave of impressions that these popular posts are going to get rather than trying to shout into the void and hope someone stumbles across your profile. Right? It's the same as marketing. You got to go out there and find where the people are. And if the audiences you want are following these people, get those impressions. Some percentage of them will click into your profile. If your profile is optimized, some percentage of them will follow you. And then over time, you'll be able to build a following that way, even if you're not tweeting that much yourself.
That's epic.
That is extremely tactical. Thank you.
Start commenting. I like it.
One thing I've noticed that's starting to drive me a little bit crazy is people using LinkedIn has that built-in like AI LLM reply feature, and it is extremely obvious when people use that, and that is unappealing.
Oh, yeah.
When you reply, it doesn't have to be the most thoughtful thing in the world, but make it authentic. Try to add some actual value with your post, even if it is just a joke.
Yeah, the funnier the post is, the more impressions it'll get and the more likes on the actual post in most cases, right? But the conversion to followers on your profile will be lower because people won't be clicking into your profile as much because it's just some funny joke. They don't care about your content, they care about the content you posted. Versus if you're going the thoughtful route, you got to be insightful, you got to be unique to get the same level of engagement. But of the people who see it, a higher percentage will click into your profile and follow you. So it's really a trade-off of what your goals are.
So on the subject of AI, I have this lingering concern that AI will do one or both of these two things. Number one, create a kind of saturation of content where there are these AI generated content farms producing niche content on anything you can possibly imagine, which will just kind of blot out the sun. Or the other is, well, why do I need to go to social media for content at all? I can just ask ChatGPT a question about anything that I'm wondering, and it'll create a bespoke and personalized and complete analysis of whatever it is I need to figure out. And so for one or both of those reasons, does AI change the game on social media brand building, influence, and content creation?
So I'll say two things to this. The first is that these systems are not advanced enough to fool you today in most cases, right?
Yeah.
Like if you see someone who's replying to something and it's like, they use the word delve, right? Like, I think this is one of ChatGPT's like favorite words relative to how often humans use it or something. Like, you can tell if a couple sentences are written by ChatGPT or not in most cases. That's the first thing I'll say. But the second thing is that I actually think this is good for creators, and I actually think it'll encourage more people to be creators, because if there's this sea of AI generated content that, maybe they have super advanced prompts, but you can sort of tell that it's very formulaic, the actual output content that is original, that's coming from someone's mind and is an authentic representation of how they feel about something, that's not on the internet. That's not in the training set that ChatGPT used to create what it's now spitting out. Right. And so if you are putting out original content, if your bar for quality is high and if your uniqueness is high, I actually think it's going to make those creators stand out even more. And it's going to make them more sought after for partnerships, more sought after for working together in any other way. I think it's going to make them stand out a lot more. And I think that more people are going to do it as a result. We'll see if that's right. But if they blot out the sun, we'll poke some holes.
Yeah, I actually strongly agree. I think we reached that saturation point a long time ago. And I was actually thinking about it earlier in the context when we were talking about the fact that, cold outreach. It used to be hard to reach someone like Sam Altman or Mark Andreessen. Now, in theory, you can DM or email anybody, right? The channels have been built out to the point where you can reach anyone on earth fairly easily. What you cannot do is get their attention. The
Right.
saturation is such that the game has changed from let's find the channel to how do I make that channel warm enough that I can actually reach them? And I think it's the same with content. First of all, is the originality of the content itself. But secondly, when is brand particularly important is when the level of differentiation actually drops, right? Like Nike makes shoes. A lot of other people make shoes. Why is Nike's brand important? Because they're in a relatively undifferentiated space. And so while I'm not saying that you should not differentiate, I think putting yourself next to your content, the more content there is, the more that's going to cut through.
Yeah. The concern, of course, here is that this is going to drive people to sort of feed into what's already a criticism of social media, which is that people just try to take extreme viewpoints to get attention, right? So to your point, if you need to stand out in that way, is that just going to make you want to say the craziest thing possible to do so? And I'm optimistic that humans will be able to recognize what is just engagement bait versus what's not. It's not always true.
The evidence suggests otherwise.
Yeah. There are personal reasons why I think Tristan is a bit of a pain in the ass. The guy's done the social dilemma and what have you. But I think one of the cleverest things he said is that we've already made contact with dangerous AI, and it's called the social media algorithm. And our first contact with AI has been disastrous. The next contact is going potentially to be much, much worse. And I disagree with you there. I think that the clickbait and polarization is already evident because of the algorithms. It's also evident because of Fox News and other things which get a pass for some reason. But I'm actually, quite concerned about the tendency towards more and more extreme content to stand out. And that is very problematic. But anyway, that is a debate for another day. The last thing I wanted to talk about was really more of a caution. On this show, we really try to counter program as well and really cut through some of the noise and talk about what most people don't talk about. And I think one of the things to be careful here about personal brand, to be a devil's advocate, is you want to be careful about becoming a talker and not a doer, a builder. And, a lot of people can get wrapped up in the personal branding game and playing that like a video game, or how do I increase my followers and my likes and my engagement and my reach? That is a means to an end, but it is not an end. And I just want to encourage the audience to looking at this from the other point of view is it's part of the mix. It's part of your career. It's part of the success of your startup, but it can't consume you. You're not actually building a real business with serious meetings, serious conversations, serious deliverables, and serious metrics. And so I just want to make sure we touch on that before we wrap up.
I think that's not uniquely true, but it's more true in the sort of like startup entrepreneur niche than most other niches, because when you're a founder, you're totally focused on your business, and the content that you're going to consume, the personal brands that you're going to build trust with, are the ones that have credibility, right? They're the ones who can say, hey, I've done this. Let me make this easier for you by telling you what works. You can choose to do it or not, but here's what worked for me. Here's what I've seen work for other people. If you don't have that initial credibility in the startup niche, it's going to be way harder to build a brand. Like, I don't think I would have been able to grow my newsletter to 90,000 subscribers if I hadn't built a company that raised from A16Z, had all this hype around it, raised a venture fund, invested in 50 companies, grew the startup to 3 million in revenue. If I hadn't done any of that, and if I hadn't maybe worked at Uber, Airbnb, and built the products that I built there, it would be a lot harder for me to say, hey, other founders who are super busy with your startups, here's why you should take time out of your day every or every week to listen to me. Even if the advice is right, the only option you have in that case is just like curating content from Peter Thiel, Paul Graham. There's a lot of these accounts right now that are anonymous meme accounts that are growing really fast because they're just reposting these video clips of really famous startup people and maybe writing a little blurb about it. And some of the people behind those accounts do have credibility, and some of them are just trying to grow the account. So I think unless you have that credibility yourself, your option is to curate. If you do have that credibility yourself, you should focus on delivering unique value.
But I think that's the point, though, like coming back to the question of finding your voice. Like, what do I talk about? How do I overcome that imposter syndrome? The way to build your personal brand is to talk about something that you do know from doing it, right? That hard-won experience. And therefore, if you're not doing anything, it is hard to build that personal brand, unless you're in the pure entertainment space or whatever. It doesn't have to be a huge thing. It can be quite a niche, right? But if you are doing something, then you are gaining expertise. Write about that. Talk about that. That's the thing that you know and will give you that credibility. But yes, you don't have to have 20 years of experience behind you. You don't have to have A16Z founded startups and large investment portfolios. What are you doing? Talk about that. And I think that's really where the value is.
Doing being the key word.
Yeah.
Yeah. Chances are your story is more interesting than you think it is.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can find the nuggets in it that are unique to you, chances are there's an audience for it out there somewhere.
Houck, this has been just a really fantastic episode, I think, full of very actionable advice for folks wanting to build a personal brand and an understanding of why they should do it. If people want to follow you, obviously you are very active on social media, you have a newsletter. Where can they find you? And yeah, how can they engage?
Yeah, sure. So if you want to check out the newsletter, you can go to join.houck.news. That's HOUCK.news. And then I'm on Twitter at Call Me Houck. I'm on LinkedIn, just Michael Houck. And if you're interested in Megaphone, want to start growing your audience, go to megaphone.network and you can sign up there, or you can also schedule time with me to chat more about it.
Okay. Michael Houck, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Chris, thanks guys. This was great.
Okay, folks, if you've been listening to an episode or two or more of the Startup Podcast and getting value from it, that means you've implicitly signed up for the Startup Podcast Pact. What that means is, in return for this amazing free value we're giving you, we are asking you to please follow us, rate us, and review us in your favorite listening app, and also on YouTube, and to give us a shout out on LinkedIn or whatever your favorite social network is. Also, tell your friends about us. We're fun. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, mate. Bye-bye.
Have a great one. This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Coda. I met Shishir, the founder of Coda, in its early days, and he told me they were reinventing documents from the ground up. They have absolutely done that, folks. Coda brings together the best of documents, spreadsheets, and apps into a single platform that really reimagines the document. One thing we wanted to emphasize today is the way that Coda can help your startup with planning, with strategy, with tracking goals. If you think about how hard it is to stay aligned around documents, roadmaps, OKRs, planning cycles, Coda is the perfect place to bring all this together. It has integrations, automations, all sorts of powerful tools and templates that allow your team to stay on the same page. And if you listen to this podcast, you know how absolutely critical that is. Coda really is a fantastic platform, and exclusively for listeners of the Startup Podcast, Coda have a special offer where you can get $1,000 of free credit if you sign up today. Support the podcast and your own startup by going to coda.io/TSP for the Startup Podcast and get started for free and get a $1,000 credit. coda.io/TSP. This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta helps businesses get and stay compliant by automating up to 90% of the work for the most in-demand compliance frameworks. With over 200 integrations, you can easily monitor and secure the tools your business relies on. Head to vanta.com/TSP for 20% off their incredible offering and start unlocking extra revenue today.